Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here. My name is Eva Posina. I serve as the Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at the college, and I'm so delighted to kick off this afternoon lecture commemorating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta King's work. First, let me remind everyone that closed captioning is now available with Zoom. On your screen are the instructions. Click live transcript icon at the bottom. Select show subtitles and you can change the font or the size. This is exciting that Zoom does this for us now. Hello, everybody. Thank you. I see more people are coming in. Welcome, welcome. Thanks for coming in into the memorable event this afternoon. I'm going to leave the closed captioning directions for a couple more seconds so we all know how to do them. All right, let's get started officially. As you all know, Agnes Scott educates women to think deeply, live honorably, and engage the social and intellectual challenges of our time. To bridge the college missions and the work we do at the college to be a more anti-racist campus, we proudly launch our Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Courageous Conversation last spring. Today's MLK keynote lecture builds on these conversations. If you miss any of them, of the previous Courageous Conversation, they are available on the college's website or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I have the pleasure of working with introducing a fabulous group of people this afternoon, starting with someone who needs no introduction, Agnes Scott College President Lee Zach. However, allow me just a couple of minutes to say something about our president. You know her work and accomplishments. Her bio is on the college website. You know she is exactly the leader that the college needs in these times. But let me share with you my own personal introductions of the president, and she doesn't know this, that I'm going to do this. So she'll probably blush when she turns on her camera, but that's okay. When I came to campus for my final interview a year and a half ago, we sat on the front porch at Rebecca. I was naturally a nervous wreck. At some point in our conversation, she said, I see that you went to school in Boston. I am from Lynn. My brain literally spun inside my head, thinking I did not hear right. See, if you do not know, Lynn is one of the few cities in Massachusetts with a minority majority population since I can remember. It is the city of immigrants in Massachusetts. Poor immigrants like my family lived in Lynn. It is a city that welcomes its diversity, unlike its neighborhood cities around it. So I was delighted to finally meet a college president that was not born from a lineage of privileges and silver spoons. I was excited at the possibility of working with someone who grew up seeing and perhaps experiencing inequity and inequality. Students, black and white, from Lynn, where my family also went to school, had very little hope for their future. Yes, our past doesn't define us, but it certainly creates a foundation for whom many of us would be. Indeed, I have come to know a president who understands what it's like to be marginalized, whose first response to any issue is always the needs of our students. In short, she is a president with the levels of empathy and perspective taking that, in my opinion, can only be learned through experiencing what it's like to not be privileged. As I said and passionately believe, she is the right leader for these unprecedented times. President Lizak.
Well, thank you very much, Eve Rose. And yes, I am blushing and proud of the city that I grew up in and its diversity and everything that it taught me. But I do recognize that I still do have privilege because of the color of my skin. And so I am so proud to be able to be learning from so many others and to be here at Agnes Scott, where we can learn together, and also that we can do that today. So thanks so much, Eve Rose. I want to welcome you all to Agnes Scott's annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta Scott King Commemorative Week. I'd like to thank the staff of the Gay Johnson McDougall Center for Diversity and Inclusion, and Dr. Eve Rose Porcina, our Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, for organizing today's event. This week, we honor Reverend Dr. Luther King Jr., Martin Luther King Jr., a man who is remembered for his work to bring hope to a nation during a tumultuous time in our history, and is doing so dedicated his life in service to others. It is undeniable that Dr. King's message of nonviolence, love, and compassion are as universal in times like today and are universal globally as well as locally. As we acknowledge Dr. King as one of his country's foremost champions and advocates of social justice, we must also honor his life partner and spouse, Mrs. Coretta King. At Agnes Scott, we live their legacy every day. As you know, we're proud to educate our Scotties to think deeply, live honorably, and engage the intellectual and social challenges of their times. This is why I am so thrilled that today's keynote speaker is one of our very own. An activist, author, scholar, and a 2007 Agnes Scott graduate, Loretta Ross will bring Dr. King's message of compassion and love to the forefront of today's event by discussing a calling in culture to spur real change and conversation. Her address today is fittingly called Beloved Community, Calling in an Agnes Scott Feminist Leader. We cannot forget the responsibility we each have in addressing injustice, but especially during these times. We must remember that we are stronger together. As leaders tackling the social challenges of our time, we have to work hard at calling people in so we may make change, calling people in with love and respect without dehumanizing them. So let us commemorate and celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta Scott King today and this week. Then let us honor them in the year ahead by committing ourselves to strategic action and courageous conversations in our homes, in our communities, in the pursuit of social justice and change. Finally, welcome again. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, President Zach. Thank you. Before I introduce our honored guests, I'd like to take a minute to meet and hear from you in the chat room. Just say hello to each other. And also talk if you can, say something, a word about how you are feeling about the racial justice movement during this important week of commemoration in DC. Just want to hear from you how you are feeling right, in this moment about the national social justice movement. And I hope you, yeah, hopeful. I was going to say, I hope you all can chat, that you're able to chat, but you are. It's open. Beautiful. Thank you. Long overdue. Yay for Boston. Ready for change. Keep putting them in. We'll keep reading them throughout our time. Ready for change. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you all. So glad to have all of you here, and I'm glad we are going to have a fabulous conversation. Let me remind those who are just coming in, closed captioning is available with Zoom. We always want to remind people of that because we are truly excited that Zoom has made that happen, and we're putting up the instruction again how to make this happen. Concerned yet hopeful comment. A lot of hopeful in the chat. Thank you all. Keep putting them in. We'll come back and keep reading them. So our plans today is to hear from our keynote speaker, followed by a Q&A with opportunities for you all to ask questions as well. The keynote address will be delivered by Loretta Ross, visiting professor at Smith College, teaching white supremacy in the age of Trump. Her pronouns are she, her, hers. She started her career in the women's movement in the 1970s, working at the DC Rape Crisis Center, the National Organization for Women, the National Black Women's Health Project, the Center for Democratic Renewal, also known as the National Anti-Klan Network, the National Center for Human Rights Education, and Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. Amazing. Her forthcoming book is called Calling In the Call Out Culture. Her most recent publications are Reproductive Justice and Introduction and Radical Reproductive Justice. There's so much more I could say about her. She's amazing. But I will say she's a graduate of Agnes Scott College, class of 2007, and we are so proud to have her. Welcome back to Agnes Scott, Loretta.
Can you see me now? I
Okay.
don't know how to get that slide off the
We
screen.
see you. We see you. We see you. Well,
Okay,
it's a pleasure to have you.
all
Just
right.
before you do your keynote, I'd like to
Mhm.
also introduce the Professor Hackett who will do the Q&A so I don't come back and disturb you. Professor Hackett is the wonderful resident expert that I turn to in my work to advance social justice at the college. She has held a joint appointment in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Philosophy departments at Agnes Scott since 1999. Her teaching and research interests includes theory of feminisms, philosophy of race, and mindfulness. Beth's pronouns are she or they, and you can see from her work why she is a perfect person to do the Q&A with Loretta today. So I will turn it over to you, Loretta, and then I will just be listening. Welcome again, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you. It's always an honor to come back to Agnes Scott, and of course, as a Scotty with the black black cat mafia ring on, I meet Scotties all over the world, and it's just such an honor and privilege to be selected to be your MLK speaker today. But before I get to my speech, I've got to offer all kinds of honor and respect to the Scotties, the Scotty professors and faculty who made it possible. Because I dropped out of college when I was 19 years old, and I didn't re-enter college until I was 48 when I came to Agnes Scott. And it took me 7 years, but I finally graduated at 55 with my grandson and my son there. And if it hadn't been for Isa Williams and Tina Pippin and Beth Hackett and so many other faculty members and administrators who helped an old girl like me get through college, I wouldn't be here now to talk to you. And I certainly didn't imagine that a short 12 years after that, I would be teaching at Smith College and just got notified that I'm awarded tenure at Smith College, which of course I owe to Agnes Scott. I also had an interesting experience when I was in South Africa in 1994 as an election monitor when Nelson Mandela got elected president. And I had a chance then to have a conversation with Gay McDougall, for whom the center is named after. And when I told Gay that I was thinking about going to Agnes Scott, she laughed. And I didn't know why she laughed. And then she privately told me that she was the first Black student admitted to Agnes Scott. And then she said, kind of wryly, good luck. And I had no idea what she meant by that. But I've had a opportunity since then to talk again with Gay. And she is so proud of the time she went to Agnes Scott, hard as it was for her to be the first Black student. And of course, she congratulated me. So my history with Agnes Scott goes way, way back from when Isa invited me to give the first feminist leadership talk. That's how I even told her that I never graduated from college, and they formed that support committee. So I unfortunately have to switch from good stuff to bad stuff because we all remember those awful events 13 days ago at the U.S. Capitol. And it made us all remember how fragile our democracy is. And as a Black feminist leader from Agnes Scott, I always think that it was that Wednesday morning was so remarkable because we woke up Wednesday morning having sent the first Black man to Congress from Georgia ever, because I live in Atlanta, by the way. And then 5 hours later, as we watched those people storm the Capitol, it turned out that we had experienced the shortest Reconstruction in history. And it was very hard to keep my hope up, very hard for me to understand how quickly white supremacy could resurrect itself and then be held almost without accountability in that moment. But I worked against the white supremacist movement here in Atlanta. I was fortunate enough to have as my boss the Reverend C.T. Vivian, who unfortunately died the same day that Congressman John Lewis died. But CT, as he liked us, he gave us permission to call him that, was the national field director for Dr. Martin Luther King. So I never got a chance to meet Dr. King, but I met the next best thing. I did have a chance to meet Coretta Scott King in a lot of my work, but I never met uh, Dr. King. But Reverend Vivian said to us when I worked at the National Anti-Klan Network that when you ask people to give up hate, then you have to be there for them when they do. And at the time he said that, my hard head was not in a very forgiving mood. It was not in a very calling in mood at all. Because in my mind, if a Black woman can't hate the Klan, I mean, who's left? But he was right. And one of the things that I've since learned, because I teach about white supremacy as an ideology, and I want to make clear that I teach the ideology of white supremacy and I don't conflate it with white people because not all white people are white supremacists. And certainly we've learned that not all white supremacists are white. But I understand that fundamental relationship between gender, anti Black racism, and anti Semitism. So I want to start off by reminding us of a similar situation in history that's very parallel to what we're dealing with right now. In 1923, Adolf Hitler in Germany led an insurrection against the German government. He didn't succeed, 4 people were killed, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He only served less than a year in jail because the German people, the ordinary German people, saw them as an extremist fringe movement that weren't that important or threatening. And so he was released from jail prematurely without being accountable. And by 1933, he had marched back into power, seizing control of the German government, the military, the culture, and it led to the Holocaust against 6 million Jews. So I just want to offer that cautionary note from history that premature forgiveness is dangerous. If we don't seek accountability and justice for those people who tried to overthrow our government, questioning the legitimacy of Black voters across this country, we are going to just let a more competent wannabe fascist get permission to try to seize power in the future. Because history, as Galliano says, never says goodbye. History just says see you later. So I want to offer that as mainstream media and Republican Congress people who are part of the insurrection are trying to rush us towards forgiveness, that we do study history and we learn from it. But the title of my speech is based on calling in and difficult conversations we need to have with each other. So I'm going to quote another civil rights icon, the Reverend Joseph Lowery, who I talked to once. And he says, we've got to learn how to turn to each other and not on each other. And this was a mantra that those in the civil rights movement who had bitter fights apparently behind closed doors learned to present a united front when it came time to confront Jim Crow segregation. And I'm wondering if it's possible for us to bring forward, like a Sankofa bird, those lessons from the past to use in our present. We need a calling in culture to guide our human rights movement. Now, you might be asking, well, why am I even calling it a human rights movement? Because Reverend Dr. King was certainly known as a civil rights leader. But one of the other things that Reverend C.T. Vivian taught me was when he surprised me by saying that Martin, and of course, only his intimates could call him Martin, because those of us in Atlanta were taught to say Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, civil rights leader, like it was all one word, or you were being disrespectful. But he said Martin never meant to build a civil rights movement. He wanted to build a human rights movement. And when he said that, that totally surprised me. And so Reverend Vivian went and pulled a copy of Dr. King's last Sunday sermon from his library shelf, and he opened it up and he read it to me. And I'm going to paraphrase. Dr. King said that we're in the midst of a triple revolution, a revolution in weaponry with our ability to destroy the planet many times over. And he was talking about nuclear weapons, a revolution in communications with our ability to talk around the world instantaneously. And I'm sure he would have been awed by the internet as I am. But he said the third part of this triple revolution is the human rights explosion that's taking place around the world. And when I first heard this speech being read by Reverend Vivian, my mind was blown like boom, because I immediately blurted out. Everybody told me Dr. King had a dream. Nobody told me he had a plan, that we're supposed to be building a human rights movement. But it's going to be hard, if not impossible, to build a human rights movement if we're so immersed in the call out culture, because we may be spending our harshest criticism on each other for not perfectly agreeing with us on every issue, rather than keeping our eyes on the prize, like Carol Anderson wrote in her famous book, Eyes Off the Prize, on those who are opposed to human rights. And so that's why I become an advocate of calling in, because I'm bringing forth those lessons from the people on whose shoulders we all stand. My own experiences as a rape survivor who's had to call in rapists, as a Black woman who's had to call in the Ku Klux Klan and the neo Nazi movement, as a Black woman in the feminist movement for 50 years who's always had to call in my problematic white allies, and now as a college professor who's teaching calling in techniques to students, because we're giving students radical language without the radical love practices to handle that radical language and that radical knowledge respectfully and responsibly. And people sometimes get confused because they don't know when to call people in or to call them out. And I think you first have to start with not being so invested in being right, but being effective, for being, for talking to people as if you're holding their hearts in your hand and you don't want to squeeze it too tight. So to end your confusion, I'll just offer you these guideposts. I use calling out for people who make mistakes and have a chance to do better, but they don't. Those are the ones I call out. But calling in is for people who make mistakes, who don't know that they've done wrong, and they want to do better. Those are the people that I call in. And we all get a chance to call people in because we all make mistakes. And unfortunately, however we were taught to handle mistakes when we were children are going to be the same ways we handle other people's mistakes as adults. So if you were publicly humiliated or shamed for making a mistake as a child, guess what? You're going to visit that same kind of punishment on others. And so part of learning the art and the science of calling people in is learning, first of all, how do you self-assess to make sure that you're in an emotional space able to offer that grace and forgiveness to others. You don't have an obligation to call people in. I mean, obviously, you have to take care of yourself first before you try to invest in somebody else. There's a middle step too. There's calling in and calling out is not a binary, it's a continuum. because you can call people in by offering those grace, that grace. You can call people out, putting them on full blast for thinking the wrong thoughts or having the wrong behaviors or getting your gender pronoun wrong or whatever. But there's a middle step too. And you can call on people to be better people where you're not making an immediate investment into their growth, but you're saying, you know, I really expect more of you in this moment. And so sit with that for a while. And then people always ask me about, well, what are some sentences? How do you start calling in? So I have some startup sentences that I teach about. But my favorite one is called, I beg your pardon. Because sometimes when you just say, I beg your pardon to something that you've heard that didn't land wrong, then people have an opportunity to rethink in their own heads what they've said without you calling them out for it. And give people that opportunity to reprocess what they've done or what they've heard or what they've said. And generally, in the reprocessing, you can figure out whether you need to call them in or call them out. Or sometimes if somebody says something like uses a word, I'm full of ableist language. Like I'll say something was lame or something was crippled or something was crazy. And so a lot of times my friends in the disability rights movement, of which I'm a member now because I'm disabled, but they'll often say, Loretta, we don't use that word anymore. Do you mind going out and having a cup of coffee to talk about what the new word is, what the new language is, and why it hurts me because I'm disabled? I mean, you have a choice about whether you choose to blow up somebody's life simply because they use something that you don't think is appropriate. And you really need to question why you want to consciously walk through the world making things worse, because that's not really how you want to be in the world. I find that when I call people out on social media, I don't feel better. I feel worse about myself because I don't want to be that person that does that. And the other thing I want to talk about is the difference between blame and responsibility. Because none of us alive can be blamed for the system, this white supremacist, misogynist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic. We know our buzzwords. We're not responsible for this system. We weren't alive when it was created. So we should stop getting into the public therapy of guilt and blame and really understand that we all share a responsibility for ending it based on who we are and based where we're coming from. And so we can, it's kind of like Isabel Wilkerson said in the Caste book. When you move into a house with bad plumbing, you don't sit up there and live it with the bad plumbing because you were the previous owner of the house. You fix the plumbing now and prepare it for your ancestors, your descendants, when they use the house. You start cleaning where you are. You don't complain about what everybody else hasn't done. So I want to close by talking about calling in as a way to build the human rights movement. I think that the young people at Agnes Scott today have an opportunity to do something that has never been done before, and that is build a united human rights movement like Dr. King asked us to do in 1968. By the way, Audre Lorde said it also a couple of decades later. I can tell you about all the people who wrote a memo we didn't listen to, starting with Frederick Douglass in 1858, about building a human rights movement in the United States. So while we're searching for new answers, we need to pay attention to the old ones that we ignored. But when I talk about the mission and the opportunity for young people today, I'm talking about I was part of building the women's movement as the director of the first Rape Crisis Center. I've also was able to join the Black portion of the civil rights movement because of obviously working on racial justice issues and anti-apartheid issues when I was young and as a teenager. I was part of the economic justice movement when I worked against housing gentrification in Washington, D.C. as a teenager and as a young person. But the mission before us now is to bring all of those separate sectors together in a united human rights movement. So that I'm now the women's wing of the human rights movement, working with the racial justice wing of the human rights movement. And this is where we're going to need our calling in strategies, because we don't all have to work on the same thing, nor do we have to work on it in the same way. If we recognize that we have to do our work on whatever we choose to focus on in a way that doesn't violate somebody else's human rights. So I can't do work against racism in a homophobic way. I can't do work against transphobia in a misogynist way. I can't do work to save the environment by blaming poor people for ruining the environment when I know they're not the cause. And so we're going to need these calling in practices so that we don't see ourselves as each other's opponents, but as our allies in the same struggle. And so young people have a chance to build that united movement that we didn't have or we didn't take advantage of earlier on. And I'm so excited because I think that young people are naturally more intersectional than any previous generation was. Most young people don't want to be placed in a box and say, I only have one identity or I only want to care for one thing. So to honor Dr. King and to live up to the privilege of having an Agnes Scott education, I want to say that this is the mission that I'm offering you. And like John Luc Picard, I'm saying make it so, because we have a chance to make the 21st century the century of human rights. The 19th century was the century of war and Jim Crow segregation and Native American genocides and all of that. The 20th century seemed to be the century of endless wars, even as our social justice movements were demanding that our human rights be known, respected, and protected. But the 21st century can be the century of human rights if we can learn to turn to each other instead of on each other. And thank y'all for letting me speak to you today.
Thank you, Loretta, so much. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to learn from you today. And it is always thought-provoking and inspiring to hear you speak. And it was so rich what you got into 20 minutes. That was incredible. Um, and so honored to count you among our WGSS alums. So
I remember those Hackett packets. They're probably online now.
yeah, well, you're in them now. Your work is in them now. Um, so the first thing I want to do is invite people to put questions for Loretta in the chat. And while that's happening, I thought I would prime the pump with a couple of questions, if I may. Mostly what I want to do, because again, this was so rich, is to invite you maybe to just elaborate on a couple of points that you made, okay? I thought that this talk of kind of a spectrum of possibilities, the calling out, calling on, calling in is really helpful to me, and that we've got those choices to make. I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more about some of the practical advice that you give to students in your classes. You know, you gave us the example of, I beg your pardon. you know, it always helps to have some things at the ready, when you're confronted with something that you want to respond to, and in that context of a radical love practice. So can you just share a bit more about some of the strategies or some of the approaches that you recommend?
Well, all calling in or calling out on starts with self assessment. You have to make sure you're in the emotional space because you don't have an obligation to help somebody else grow.
Mhm.
If attending to your own healing is your priority, do yourself first. So sometimes you'll just say, talk to the hand. I'm not in the space for that right now. But you can say that with the calling in promise. I'm not in the space to talk about that now, but can we talk later?
Mhm.
So you can
Mhm.
make it a calling in even as you protect your own boundaries. But
Mhm.
it's a choice that you get to make. So the first thing you have to do is take your own emotional temperature to see if you have the bandwidth to help somebody else out. Then you have to assess what you're trying to achieve with it, because you have no control over someone else's ability or capacity for taking this gift that you're offering them. I mean, if we could magically control other people's behavior, we wouldn't fight in our relationships. So we can't control other people, but we can take charge of offering to other people, a new perspective, whether or not we're going to offer them a chance to further explain themselves. You see a lot of people who do racist things, for example, like Barbecue Becky or Central Park Amy. And the first thing they say is that that doesn't represent who I am inside, even though you saw this behavior. So a calling in is helping people to align their inner selves with their outer behavior. So I would say to Central Park Amy, I know that's probably not who you are inside. I can believe you in that. So, what can you do differently so that you can represent yourself better instead of defaulting to the white supremacist programming that caused you as a white woman to call the police on a black man when you were the one breaking the law? I mean,
Right, right.
we need to have uh, better alignment between our high, good, and inner opinions of ourselves and what we actually do. And so those would be some preparatory things you do. First of all, make sure that your inner and outer selves are aligned. That's what that self assessment is. But also accept that everyone you meet is as complicated as you are. So if you see something that's out of alignment, don't jump down their throat for it, but just ask, give them the grace to help figure it out. Sometimes by offering new information, sometimes just giving the loving attention of listening is enough to get them to rethink their view. You can't flip Klansmen, you can't flip Nazis, but most people are not Klansmen and Nazis. Most people are racially illiterate, gender illiterate, somewhat fragile over their lack of knowledge. And you need to accept that that's the reality that you're dealing with versus the world you actually want.
Mhm. Great, great. So this is I think a related question from the chat, which someone was asking, can you talk about why calling in is so much harder with family and close friends? It is for me, I don't know about others.
It's so much harder with family and friends because we have a larger emotional investment in maintaining the relationship with those families and friends. But you also have advantages in that. One time, one of my older brothers, my oldest brother, as a matter of fact, said something that was incredibly racist to me about Mexican Americans because I'm from San Antonio, Texas. So black people are inculcated in saying racist things about Mexican Americans because we're used as the buffer class to keep them out of the economy. There's white people. The largest population is Mexican Americans, 60% of the population. So the white people would use the black people giving us the jobs to keep the Mexicans out of the economy. I grew up seeing no Mexican signs instead of no colored signs. And so my brother was trained to say all these racist things about Mexican Americans. I knew I could probably not change Charles's opinion because, I mean, he's 17 years older than me. He's not, one that I could manage upward kind of thing. So I just stopped Charles in his tracks and said, Charles, do you love me? And he looked at me like, why would you ask such a silly question? You're my baby sister. Of course I love you. I said, well, if you love me, do you know when you say those things, it hurts me? And do you want to continue to hurt me? Do you know that was in 1980? And I've never heard Charles say another negative word about Mexican Americans in my presence. I don't know if he thinks it in his heart, but he doesn't say it in my presence. So you can actually use the advantage of having a relationship with somebody to ask them to rethink their behavior by telling the truth of its impact on you.
That's really, really interesting. Um, so this is another question from the chat that's sort of related in terms of how do you approach different populations, when you're really when you're in different relationships. So I take it this is a faculty member asking. I'd love to hear Loretta Ross's advice for how faculty can best support our students in calling in during class when is an I beg your pardon moment.
Well, I actually wrote an article for the Teaching Tolerance magazine for the Southern Poverty Law Center that's
Hmm.
called Speaking Up Without Tearing Down. And
Hmm.
that's about classroom instructions.
Okay,
How you
perfect.
set calling in guidelines at the outset when you're doing that initial orientation of the class ground rules and you're reviewing the syllabus and things like that. What happens when an incident happens in your classroom and you don't want to just give it a pass, but at the same time you don't want the student who caused the incident to be isolated and jumped on by the other students. Uh, so there's techniques you can learn, and I offer an overview of them in the article, and I teach very specifically how faculty and teachers can handle that. But
Great.
it starts with setting an atmosphere of critical and creative inquiry without personalizing it. You can have debate on ideas without making a personal attack, because one of the things with call out is there's an instant magnification. You go from criticizing an idea that you disagree with, then assuming that that person has to be of bad moral character because they had that idea. And then the next thing you know, well, people start shunning the person because don't want to be associated with people of bad moral character. And the next thing you know, you've got a ideological bullying mob blaming and shaming the person. And so I teach about how those things are, that escalation happens and what we can do about them.
Hmm. That's great. I'll get that and share the link with folks. I'll get that article. So I'm thinking about where your comments started today, which was with the storming of the U.S. Capitol by a group that included white nationalists, and then the myriad acts of terror perpetuated by avowed white supremacists leading up to that, and as well as the rampant hold that conspiracy theories, including conspiracy theories, are having that have racial implications, have on so many people. And there, I can imagine some people thinking that, look, calling in is just not the answer. Calling in is just not an option in this environment. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I do believe that there's some people who do need to be called out now.
Hmm.
I'm not saying take
Right.
calling out off the table,
Hmm.
because if people aren't willing to be held accountable for the harm that they did, then you've actually given permission for them to do more harm. And that is
Hmm.
not the desired goal.
Right.
And so that's why I told the Hitler story at the
Right.
outset, to make
Hmm.
that distinction. But at the same time, I'm watching the media this morning, all filled with this cult analysis that 71 million members of people who voted for Trump are cultists. And I'm like, this is not mass psychosis. 71 million people don't go simultaneously crazy over the same 4-year period. Psychologists would say that's possible. So calling them a cult is a disservice in my mind. They are people who have been brainwashed by white supremacy. And we need to own that as part of our history. And the more we deny that, the further we kick down the field the opportunity to excavate it. Because when Dr. King said, are we facing chaos or community? That's still the same question facing America right now. Are we going to descend into chaos in an apartheid like system where only some voters, because of the race of their skin, matters, and the other voters sit under an apartheid like disrespecting and discounting of their vote? Or are we going to build that beloved community? I maintain that if we had held the traitors responsible in 1865 who made war on our democracy, we wouldn't have seen the Confederate flag in the US Capitol in 2021. So I don't want to be one of those people whose descendants are going to be asking me, well, why didn't you do something in 2021? Because I'm asking the people in 1865, why didn't you handle it then?
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, so this is a slightly different kind of question from the chat, and it is, so what grounds you? In other words, to extend grace means one needs to be somewhat secure in oneself. Do you have spiritual practices or some such things that sustain you?
What sustains me is that I make a lot of mistakes. I wish I was some magical person. Oh no. I've made mistakes so large they ended up in the Washington Post. And so when your worst mistakes are in national discourse, you either run from them, you blame them on somebody else, or you grow from them. And what grounded me and sustained me was the elder Black women around me who didn't give up on insufferable me. They're the ones that called me in and said, "No, Loretta." Matter of fact, one of them, Amal Saran, gave me my best life advice. She said, "Loretta, when you know bad news about yourself, run and tell it first. And that's the only way you'll control the narrative. If other people tell it on you, trust me, they're not going to tell it through your lids. They're not going to tell it with respect for your dignity and your heart." And I've used that advice ever since that Washington Post story came out. Like, if I know bad stuff about myself, I run and tell it first. Matter of fact, even when I'm in interviewing for jobs, I used to tell them the worst thing I know about myself in the interview so that you hire me based on who I am and not who I'm pretending to be. But the other thing, just back to my own practice, my generative practices. First of all, I party as hard as I work, and I have a toggle switch that can turn my consciousness off so that I can watch Twilight without doing a critical gender analysis of Bella and Edward. So toggle off, have fun, toggle back on, do the work kind of thing. And and I think that the most important lesson was from another one of my mentors, Leonard Zeskin, who's a Jewish guy who was the one that taught me everything I know about fascism. And he said, "Loretta, lighten up. Fighting Nazis should be fun. It's being a Nazi that sucks." And he shifted my perspective with just that one line. Because when you do civil rights work and human rights work, you get to see the ugliest things human beings do to each other.
Yeah.
And it's easy to fall into a black hole of despair and hopelessness and cynicism. Like when I worked at the Rape Crisis Center, I had to learn that not all men are rapists just because I was looking at that sector of them who were, kind of thing. And so keeping balance, I also find, because I'm 67 years old now, that keeping apolitical people in my life is a godsend. And so the same time I'm doing protests against the war, they're doing yellow ribbon parties for the soldiers. But they
Mhm,
keep me balanced, and I
mhm,
love them as dearly as I love my political friends. And I know that when I finally die, they're going to be at my funeral just like my family and my political friends because they're in my life because they're good people who have different political views than I do.
mhm. Okay. Well, here's another kind of question about you. So, why did you choose to go back to school, and what made you choose Agnes Scott?
I first went to college when I was 16, and I went to Howard University majoring in chemistry and physics, but I was also a teen mother at the time. I had a child at 15 through incest. So it was very, very hard managing being in college, thousands of miles away from home because I'm from Texas and I was in Washington, D.C. Hadn't dealt with the trauma of being a rape and incest survivor, so that was also in my head. And then I was the first woman in the chemistry department at my college. So I didn't get a lot of support from the men who didn't think I had a right to be there. So I don't want to blame anybody, but I was just not healthy enough emotionally to go to college at 16 as a teen mother, an incest survivor, a pioneer in the chemistry department, thousands of miles away from my support system. So after 3 years, I dropped out. I mean, I can always speak to the external pressures about President Nixon changing the student loan requirements that caused me to lose my student loans because I was an out of state student in Washington, D.C., who couldn't get a loan from a bank and all of that. But that's a rationalization because I've never let any obstacle I face stop me. So if I really wanted to stay in school, President Nixon be damned, I would have stayed in school. But then I felt like a college failure for so many years that I didn't do it then. Maybe I'm not good enough to do it. So that's when the imposter syndrome came up. And so it wasn't until Isa Williams asked me this very poignant question. She said, Loretta, with all that you've done in life, and this was like the fourth or fifth time I'd done the feminist leadership lecture for her. She said, well, Loretta, with all you've done in life, what haven't you done? And then this little baby voice I said, graduate from college. And Isa took charge of that sentence and made sure that I graduated from college. So that's what made me went back because I had a sisterhood of support
Mhm.
that helped me overcome my fears. But I didn't know how to fill out the application. I didn't know how to use all this computer technology. Guess what? I blew a final in a class because I didn't know what the final process was. I showed up on final day expecting to take a test. I didn't know I had to register ahead of time to let the test
Mhm.
people know I was going to show up.
Right, right.
I mean, I got a B in a class because I blew the final. Because there was just so much I didn't know.
Yep, yep. All right. Well, sadly, I can't believe how swiftly this time has flown. So just a one last question for you. So you've been an anti-racist feminist thought leader and activist for many, many years. What final words of advice do you have for our students and all of us as we live through these extraordinarily challenging times?
I guess I have to channel my mother now because when I went off to college at 16, and my mother and I did not have what you call a peaceful relationship because I was very headstrong and she was very Southern evangelical Christian. But she said to me, Loretta, what I admire about you is that you never let success go to your head. I said, oh, Ma, I understand. I read Reader's Digest like you do. She said, shut up. Let me finish. But she always had to say to me, she said, no, you don't let success go to your head, but most importantly, you don't let failure go to your heart. And I never let failure go to my heart. And that's the last words I'd say to students.
All right, that is really, really wonderful. I wish we had more time. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Eves Rose.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you
y'all for
so
having
much,
me.
Beth. Thank you for this fabulous Q&A. I am in awe. Thank you, Loretta, for the fabulous. No, you stay with me, Loretta. I want to thank you in
Okay,
person.
thank you. I'll stay on
No,
here.
that's okay. I just wanted to really say thank you. This was really inspiring and moving. And it just, as I was sitting here, I said I have to bring her back for like a 3-hour training session for all of us, for myself, beginning with me, because this talk is that a lot enough. So thank you so very much. Okay, now you can turn off.
All right, thank y'all, and it's an
Thank,
honor always to come back to ASC. I want to come to Decatur, I really do, and I will as soon as COVID is under control. Okay.
Will do. Thank you. And I do want to say a few more thank you, President Lee for opening, and of course, Beth for the Q&A, and Rafa. Actually, I was sitting there thinking, Rafa, thank you for telling me, introduce me to Loretta Ross work. Like when I first got here, the very first month I was here, so thank you for that. I do want to remind all of us that, it's great that we do these talks, but talk is never enough. And so we have a fabulous justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion plan that we will be revealing on Friday and going through it and asking for your commitment on how you're going to make it happen and giving tips and recommendation on how you can make this a reality at Agnes Scott. So we hope to, this is for the Agnes Scott community, faculty, staff, and students at the college, Friday, January 22nd at 3 p.m. Come in to roll up your sleeves. This is not a lecture. It's to figure out how do we make the goals in the plan a reality. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon and have a great MLK week of commemoration.